Thank you, Michal. Next speaker, Michael Shalev from the Taub Center in Jerusalem and also from the Hebrew University, will talk on states, classes, and challenges to neoliberalism. Michael. Okay.
I'm going to put you back on the roller coaster that we were on this morning. I apologize for doing that because I actually much preferred the tempo of Michal's talk, but it's too late. The damage is done. I don't just have an iceberg on my PowerPoint. And the title is a little bit changed, but the idea is the same. Okay, so I want to look at some economic and political forces that might explain three paradoxical features of the social protests of last summer. What are these puzzles? First of all, the puzzle that Yossi has been talking about that's addressed by the joint research that he and I have been engaged in and that I've been working on through some additional research that uses some somewhat different methods and data. That puzzle is essentially, why would the educated middle-class youth of Tel Aviv and university students in other countries who led the in other cities who led the social protest movement, what was their economic motivation for entering on this adventure, given that when we look at the closest parallel case, which is the Spanish Indignados, the economic conditions are completely different. In Israel, the economy is in a state of recovery. Youth unemployment is not a major problem. The wages and incomes are not going up dramatically, but they are not in decline. And it looks as if the demands and the presentation of the economic deprivations of the middle-class younger generation is way out of proportion to the kind of deprivations that we would anticipate to produce such a powerful reaction. Second puzzle. If the issue was, in fact, that the economic position of the middle class has eroded in the current younger generation, why didn't they simply demand more benefits for the middle class? They did make some of their demands in relation to issues that are of particular interest to the middle classes, like home ownership in the more expensive areas of the country, like child care issues, which are important both to middle class and working class people. But why did they choose such an inclusive and encompassing motto as the people demand social justice? Why did they feel they had to speak in the name of the people, and why social justice? And why the demand for a revived, more egalitarian welfare state? Third and finally, why is it that the groups that are in Israeli society, the most disadvantaged groups, we've heard about them this morning, portrayed as a social problem, let's think about their deprivations and grievances, their poverty levels, and so on. The ultra-Orthodox, the Haredim, the Palestinian Arab citizens of Israel, parts of the former immigrants from the Soviet Union, the immigrants from the former Soviet Union. These are the groups that have experienced the most deprivation, as I'll show you in a slide borrowed from something that Eyal did, last year's report of the Taub Center. So why did these groups, who on the face of it had the most to gain from a movement for social justice, closing gaps, reviving the welfare state, why were they the least engaged in the social protest movement? Okay? So, I'm going to take you through some things in a few seconds because you've already seen them before, presented differently. One is the very high Gini index in Israel. That means we're a very unequal society. The second is that the gap between inequality in markets, which is on the top, and inequality that actually occurs between households and the income that they have in their disposal, that gap has changed direction since the reforms of 2003. What has happened is that the inequality in disposable income has risen, while inequality in market income has fallen. And this is because the government changed direction. It cut benefits for the poor, and it cut taxes for the rich. Third, this is where I'm borrowing from something that Eyal did. In the course of the 2000s, what happened to poverty? Among the three groups that I mentioned before, poverty increased very substantially. Among the rest of the country, it decreased almost to the average level of the OECD. Finally, who profited? We have poor data on this. As Eran mentioned, the work of Saez and Piketty and Atkinson, one could also mention, that's been done in many, many countries on inequality at the very top. We don't have very good data on that right now, but we do have some data that was leaked to or obtained by an Israeli newspaper. During the 2000s, the only decile of the income distribution that increased its share of national income was the top decile. They increased their share by 9%. Deciles 2 through 8 fell. The top 100th, the top percentile share, rose by 15%. This looks very similar to the United States and other countries which have experienced radical increases in the inequality between the very rich and the rest of us. So, where did this leave the young, middle-class, educated people who led the social protest movement, who came out of middle-class families? Well, they're not among the big losers. They're not Haredim, Arabs, or Russians from the periphery. But they're not in that top 1%. We need to have a broader picture of what's been happening in the Israeli political economy to get a sense of the grievances that they might have. They might have grievances relating to the price of housing and the availability of housing, particularly in the Tel Aviv area, and they do. They might have grievances about job opportunities in the labor market, which have shrunk in terms of their benefits, for an important part of the educated middle class, while other parts, more advantaged parts of the educated middle class, have improved their position. So we have inequality within this generation. And they were also angry over the fact that the government raised prices that are in its domain, or let monopolies get away with raising prices which are in their domain. So there's lots of economic grievances that one can actually see without having data on how much difference this made to people's lifestyles or standards of living. We have to remember that people's feelings about whether their share of the pie is just depend precisely on that, their share of the pie. So whereas in the research that Yossi and I did together, which he reported on earlier, our focus, partly for data reasons, was on inequality among the younger generation, okay, in relationship to their class origins. Here I have different data. I don't have information on their class origins, which is a big minus, but I do have information on where young people are located in the overall hierarchy of incomes in Israel. And that's what I want to focus on and suggest to you that there has actually been some significant deterioration. This is work that I've been doing at the Taub Center with Chaim Blich. So I'm going to just tell you one thing about it. We're looking at young families, that is, families where the head of the household is under 35, and they're married and have children, and at least one of the parents is working. Okay? This ought to be the core of the potential middle class of the younger generation. And we're looking at income, family income adjusted for the size of the household. Okay. And just one more technical thing. What you're going to see here in this chart is in percentiles. That is, we divide all the households in the country up into 100 equal parts, and we ask ourselves, where does the household that is headed by a young person fit in that system of 100 portions? Okay, what percentile are they located in? So here are 3 age groups observed every year since 1995. The youngest age group at the bottom in blue is 25 to 29. The next one is the 5-year group right above it, 29 to 34, and above them the next 35 to 39. Okay, you can see the trajectories are very, very different. The very young group, its position in the income structure, which began at about the 45th percentile, by 2010 had declined to about the 30th percentile. Okay, that's a huge change. A much less dramatic change in the group above them, who in recent years, their position in the income structure deteriorated, and even slight deterioration in the group above them. Now, there's a limitation when you look at things this way because you're looking at a different group of people entering every year, right? The 25 to 29 group in 1990 is not exactly the same people as in 1991, and so forth. So you can look, as Eyal did in part of his presentation, at cohorts, or what are actually synthetic cohorts. You can follow what ought to be more or less the same group of people over a period of time. And so what I've done here is taken 3 cohorts. These are groups of people who are aged 25 to 29, married with children, at least one person working. And I look at the group that entered the system in 1995, that's the blue line, the group that entered in 2000, the red line, the group that entered in 2005, the green line, and the group that entered and is only visible once in 2010, that's the purple dot. Okay? And what we see is that the first 3 cohorts all entered at about the same percentile of the income structure. The first 2 of them managed, after about 5 years, to stabilize their position at around about the 65th or 63rd, I can't read it from here either, percentile. The 3rd cohort seems to be delayed. Okay? It's in the system for only 5 years. We don't know whether it will rise up to the level of the cohorts that preceded it, but based on their 5-year performance, they're not going to. Okay? I can't tell you what will happen, but people presumably experience this in their own lives. And the final cohort, which we only see for 1 year, enters the system, as we already saw from the graph on the left-hand side, at a low position in the 30th percentile. Now I want to look at another aspect of relativities that are relevant to understanding whether young families feel, in some sense, economically deprived. Okay? What I was looking at until now was where they're located in the income hierarchy of the whole society. Now I'm asking a different question. I'm pointing to the fact that the young are not a homogeneous group socially. I'm going to look only at 3 very simple divisions because they're the ones that it's easiest for me to look at with this data, or that's feasible for me to look at, between the majority of these young families, 72%, who are Israeli-born Jews, and 2 minorities, Arabs and immigrants from the former Soviet Union. Okay, I'll just skip that. Now, here's a question. When we divide up the young families into these 3 groups, how are they doing over time in positioning themselves in the higher reaches of the income structure? Okay? The higher reaches for people who have an academic degree, I've defined here as the top quintile, the top 20%. Now, if you look at the left of the chart, you see what's happened over 4 sub-periods to Israeli-born Jewish heads of household. What proportion of them are in the top quintile of the income distribution? In the late 1990s, that proportion is about 45%. By the eve of the social protest movement, it's only 30%. Now look at the next group, the immigrants from the former Soviet Union. There, the situation, the trend is reversed. They start very low. Only about 12-13% of those households reach the top quintile, even though they have university degrees. But look how that proportion is rising until the last few years when it declines somewhat. The Arab-Israeli academically trained families, they start low and end even lower. Now I'm just going to show you the parallel chart for families where the head of the household does not have an academic degree. And here the criterion for getting to the top or flying high is being not in the top quintile, but at least in the top 40% of the income distribution. And here we see the same pattern. We see that the situation of the veteran Israeli Jews has deteriorated relative to the society as a whole. The situation of the Jews from the former Soviet Union has improved relative to the society as a whole, and the situation of the Arabs has remained dismal relative to the society as a whole. Now, I'm going to show you a statistical exercise which can help us pinpoint this a little bit further. Think of it this way. People with what I'll call in a very general way, middle-class advantages. In the Israeli context, what could middle-class advantages be that I'm able to measure? Okay? The first one is a university education. The second one is living in the Tel Aviv area rather than beyond that. The third one, very crucial for middle-class households, is that both spouses work. And the fourth one is coming from what traditionally was a more favorable origin, i.e. being a veteran Israeli-born Jew rather than either a new immigrant or an Arab. Okay? And what I do in this statistical exercise is, because these advantages often tend to go together, okay? The veterans are more educated, they tend to live more in the Tel Aviv area, etc., etc. So I use a statistical model which tries to sort out the effects of these different influences and the relationships between them. And we're looking at the same thing. We're looking at what percentile of the income distribution does a young family end up with? How can we explain that? Okay. Now, this is going to be easy to understand. On the basis of this statistical model, which, as I said, takes into account all of these advantages that I mentioned, also takes into account age, because this is a diverse group between 25 and 35. There are big differences among them. Here is what the model predicts will be the percentile position in the income distribution of young families that have a degree or don't have a degree, where the head has or doesn't have a degree, with the other advantages taken into account. Okay? Now, what's the key? The key is that being advantaged, in this case having a college degree, was no insurance against losing ground over this period. In fact, the two lines, as you can see, are virtually parallel. Same idea, living in the Tel Aviv area. Living in the Tel Aviv area has actually become more profitable relative to living elsewhere, but the deterioration in the 2000s of the relative position of young families is clear also for people who live in the Tel Aviv area. The age gap, again, being in the upper tier of that young age group with no insurance against erosion. And interestingly enough, being in a dual earner household rather than a single earner household, which as you can see, and obviously makes a huge difference to the household's position in the income distribution, also with no insurance. In fact, their position deteriorated more, substantially more, than the position of single earner families. And finally, how about the advantage of being an Israeli-born Jewish head of household compared with being either from the former Soviet Union or Arab? Well, we can see here again, but in a more reliable way, this scissors movement between the erosion of the position of the Israeli-born Jews and the improvement in the position of the Russian-born Jews and non-Jews, one should say. And the position of the Arabs relative to the Israeli-born veteran Jews actually improves slightly because the former group deteriorates more than the latter group. Now, having said all that, and I hope the import is clear, I do think there have been serious sources of deterioration in the economic position of young would-be middle-class families in Israel. We cannot assume that economic grievances translate automatically or mechanically into political grievances and political action. The social protests are a form of political action which is structured by political cleavages, political discourses, and political institutions. So we have to then ask ourselves, and this is going to help us deal with the other puzzles that I raised, rather than just the one of the material grievances, we have to ask ourselves what political context shaped the social protest movement. Now, there's a lot of things one could say in that respect, and I'm only going to look at a couple of them. First of all, when it comes to redistribution, that is the role of the state in taxing and spending, there's a consensus, a remarkable consensus in Israel, that inequality is a bad thing and that the state is the party that's responsible for narrowing inequality. This consensus is more profound than in almost any other country in the world for which we have public opinion data. And it's also been quite solid over the years. For instance, about 2/3 of Israelis think that socialism is a better economic system than capitalism. This was the case in the 1960s, it was the case in the 1970s, it's the case today. Now what that means is open to interpretation, but I think it means what I'm about to emphasize, which is first, the fact that the state was created by collective action and by an ethos of collectivism. Secondly, that inequality is threatening from the perspective of Israeli Jews who are concerned about Jewish demography. People should want to come to Israel, Jews should want to come to Israel, and they should want to stay there, and they are concerned that too much inequality could prevent that. And secondly, they recognize that Israel is a very burdensome and demanding place to live, and they feel that the state ought to compensate Jewish citizens for living there. And what's fascinating is the consensus about inequality in Israel crosses all sorts of boundaries. It crosses the left-right boundary, what's called left and right in Israeli politics. It crosses the generational boundary. It crosses the class boundary. Okay. Here's one quote that for me sums it all up. Anybody here who knows the Israeli scene knows who Merav Arlozorov is. She's an economic journalist, senior economic journalist with the Marca, the Haaretz economic paper. And here is something she said at a conference that I attended in 2009. A free market economy is essential for the economic progress of all strata of society. She's very strongly neoliberal in her economic views. But Israel cannot afford the extreme inequality which now afflicts us. My grandfather, that's Chaim Arlosoroff, the labor movement leader who was murdered in the pre-state period, would turn over in his grave if he were alive today. Okay? This is an oxymoron. Okay? If you believe in free markets, you have to be ready to live with inequality. And Meirav Arlosoroff tells us that she believes in free markets, but Israel can't afford inequality. So that's the consensual side of redistribution in Israel. But there's also a very powerfully conflictual side to redistribution in Israel. And that is based, as it always is everywhere, on the question of who is more deserving. But in Israel, the question of deservingness is shaped in a very specific way because of the factors I mentioned earlier. The national cleavage, the demographic agenda of the state, the military burden, and so on. So who deserves the protection of the state? Okay. Now, there is one group of people, or several groups of people, who, as you noticed, include the most poverty-stricken populations, who form the social basis of the political right in Israel. And they have parties, they form what my late colleague Baruch Kimmerling called the tribes of Israel, the contemporary tribes of Israel, and they have political parties affiliated with them, and these political parties pursue demands which are simultaneously demands for more redistribution and demands for recognition, that is to say, moral standing, okay? The recognition that we have made a contribution to the collective, for instance, by studying the Talmud in our yeshiva, and therefore the collective ought to sustain us, okay? Now, each one of these groups has a different rationale for why it is they are deserving, okay? But the important thing is that those rationales are in conflict with one another and with the arguments made by the group that considers itself not to be a tribe, which is what the group that has traditionally defined itself as the middle class and which led the social protest movement. The more advantaged, the largely but not entirely Ashkenazi, secular, so-called, and veteran population. These groups are the social basis of what used to be the left and is now largely the center in Israel. And they reject the idea that the groups, the tribes, have a right to state subsidy and recognition. They argue that they are above sectors. They are universal, and they contribute to the common good. Here's a wonderful example of this discourse. Yair Lapid, another journalist who is now clearly shaping up as a candidate for the next elections in Israel, whenever or wherever they be. The country does not belong to interest groups and lobbyists, not tycoons and not unscrupulous, that's my addition, political parties. The country belongs to us. It belongs to those who pay taxes, who do reserve duty, and whose children are conscripted into the army. It belongs to the Israeli middle class. Okay? Who's not paying taxes? Who's not serving in the army? Several of the critical tribes that I mentioned earlier, I didn't mention the Arab tribe because they have very little capacity of demanding that the state recognize their deservingness since they cannot be considered as contributing to the demographic and security goals of the Jewish majority. So what Yair Lapid actually tells us here was very largely borrowed from the discourse that developed in the social protest. It's a discourse that was not the official discourse of the protests. It was the underground or the backstage discourse of the protests. The sense that we are the middle class, we work, we struggle, we pay our taxes, we do our miluim, and the government has abandoned us. Okay? It looked after our parents. They got subsidized housing. They enjoyed the benefits of hyperinflation. But we are left to deal with the downside of the neoliberal economy, its tough labor markets, its outsourcing, its temporary employment, its vicious housing market, and so forth. The protest leaders were very intelligent politically. They recognized the fact that there are these two consensual and conflictual discourses of distribution and redistribution in Israel. The consensus about equality and the conflict over who is deserving and how do you become deserving. And so they took a path which I think was very sensible in political terms. They chose the consensual discourse, and they avoided anything that could arouse the conflictual discourse. So even though the tribes, the undeserving tribes, were in the background to the dissent and the frustration felt by the young middle class and their parents who participated heavily in the social movement, the leadership of the movement adopted the consensual discourse, tried to be strictly apolitical, not arouse the ghosts, and build a coalition which would cross the boundaries of class and tribe. And even in the discussion I could go into making that a little bit more concrete. Okay, so I only have a few minutes to show you some other findings which have to do with the third paradox I raised, which was how come the people who need social justice and equality the most didn't support the social protest movement to the same extent as those who seemingly need it least, the middle class, young people and their parents. So I think there are two things that we have to understand about public opinion in Israel vis-a-vis the social protests. One is the very high degree of consensus, okay? Very, very few people, maybe 5%, depends which survey you looked at, when asked, do you support the social protests at the time that they were happening, said no, okay? A smaller number of people, about 10, 15%, maybe 20, again depending on the survey, said they didn't support it strongly, okay? But 75 to 80% said they support it strongly, okay? So I'm labeling that, borrowing from, if you're old enough, you may have seen the film Network with William Holden in 1976. So William Holden is a network anchorman who invents a slogan. That he says, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore, okay? Wonderful movie. So that's the sentiment that brought the country together in all its tribes behind the social protests. But then there are these, what I call, institutionalized political cleavages around the different tribes and their political parties and their ideologies, which are also at play, dividing support for the protests in more subtle ways. So just to end, I'm going to show you some findings on that which come from the Taub Center's annual social survey, which was conducted just 2 weeks after the monumental so-called demonstration of the million, which was a demonstration of 400,000 on September 3rd, which is an astounding number in itself, by the way, far greater than occurred in Spain with a population of 46 million. So, take a look at this chart. This is an easy one, actually. This one is not from our data. It's from the Peace Index, which is done every month. That's why it's helpful. So what I'm going to show you is the proportion of Israelis who said they strongly support the protests. And on the x-axis, they're divided by whether they define themselves as left or right. And they were specifically guided in our survey also to answer in relation to the traditional understanding of left and right. That is, issues of foreign policy and security. Okay? Hebrew. So this is how it looked in late July during, let's call it, phase one of the social protests. We see a very clear trend for strong support for the protests to be greater among people who define themselves as left than as right. But let's face it, 60% of those who define themselves as strongly on the right strongly supported the protests, so it's not a huge gap. In late August, when the protest movement is nearly reaching its peak, the gap has widened. And now it's a gap between 40% in the right-wing camp to about 75% in the left-wing camp. Yeah. Two charts quickly presented, and then I will step down. This is from the Taub data. Okay? It's the same outcome, the proportion who strongly supported the protests. There are different lines for different groups that it was possible to identify using the Taub data. And along the x-axis, there are different levels of response to the question, do you feel you and your family may be running into serious economic difficulty sometime in the next year or so? Okay? So we see two things. If we look at that x-axis, we see that in general, if people feel that they are likely to run into a lot of economic difficulty, that's over on the right side of the chart, they are more likely to strongly support the protests no matter what group they belong to. Okay? However, that's not the big story. The big story is the differences between the groups. So the most supportive group is the group that defines itself as secular or traditional. The next supportive group, very interestingly, is the Arabs. I can talk about that later. Next, at the bottom, come people who define themselves as Dati or Haredi, and who come from the former Soviet Union. And I'm squeezing this in 1 second. Final. This is the proportion of people who said they demonstrated. Okay, it's very different to passively support a protest movement and to go out onto the streets. And here the difference is much more stark. The group that define themselves as secular or traditional, there around about 1/3 of them or more reported demonstrating. It has no connection to whether they feel economic distress or not. Arabs and the religious, much lower proportion. Interestingly, some groups of Russian Israelis quite prominent in the demonstrations. Okay, I'll get to the interpretation when you ask me some difficult questions in the break. Thank you.